Governing Texas Chapter 12 Public Policy. Why Public Policy Matters. One of the most important responsibilities of the state is protecting those who can't protect themselves. In Texas, this massive task falls to the 13,000 employees of the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, DFPS. One of the most sensitive programs run by the DFPS is Child Protective Services, CPS. CPS's job is to investigate cases of child neglect or abuse, and when necessary, remove a child from parents' custody and place the child in a relative's home or in a foster home. One might think that CPS would be a relatively small issue. The province of policy wonks and interested family members. But by the 2017 session of the legislature, CPS had become one of the top concerns of the governor and the legislative leaders. Why and how this happened says much about why public policy matters. Advocates for children in Texas have long bemoaned the underfunding of CPS. The state employs too few caseworkers to watch over the foster care program, and turnover is too high. In 2004, DFPS calculated that a caseload of 25 clients per worker would theoretically allow caseworkers to have meaningful contact with all children in their charge. In reality, the actual caseload per worker was around 34. The state made disturbingly little effort to look at the workload of caseworkers or evaluate the effects of the high average caseloads or caseworker turnover on the children themselves. In 2011, a New York-based advocacy group brought a class action suit on behalf of all children in long-term care in Texas. In a 260-page ruling, U.S. District Judge Janice Jack of Corpus Christi found that the excessive caseloads and overburdened caseworkers cause an unreasonable risk of harm to foster children. The court found that almost 3,000 children considered to be at risk each day were seen by caseworkers outside of the required 24-hour period following a report of possible abuse or not seen at all. Things were so bad that the U.S. Constitution that foster children had to be free from and a reasonable risk of harm caused by the state. The court ordered DFPS to implement reforms that protected children and directed the agency to hire enough caseworkers to ensure that caseloads were manageable. The court ruling, in addition to the $40 million deficit that CPS faced in 2017, placed CPS reform high on Governor Abbott's legislative agenda for the 2017 session. Lieutenant Governor Patrick and House Speaker Strauss called upon DFPS Commissioner Hank Whitman to immediately develop a plan to hire and train more caseworkers. They also called upon the agency to create a culture of accountability. As a result, 4 major bills were passed during regular session that addressed the Child Protective Service crisis. If one of the goals of this legislation was to get the court out of the business of reforming child welfare, the legislature failed. In January of 2018, Judge Jack ruled that CPS would remain under the watchful eye of a court-appointed special master. Years of inaction by Texas officials led by the judge to argue that officials could not be trusted to act in the best interests of children under the care of the state. Texas represented by Attorney General Paxton appealed the ruling on the grounds that unelected judges should not be allowed to assume control of the state's institutions. A second federal court ordered a temporary stay of Jack's final ruling and asked for more information about the case. An appeals court later upheld the judge's rulings, allowing for the appointment of 2 monitors to oversee that Texas was actually following the new rules. Child Protective Services was a backburner issue for most of the 2019 legislative session, but it came to the forefront again in November of 2019 when Judge Jack found the state in contempt of court for failing to comply with her earlier orders. Judge Jack was direct and forceful in criticism of state officials. I can no longer find the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to be credible in any way. It's shameful. You cannot be relied upon for anything, period. The conflict between Judge Jack and the state intensified in late February of 2020 when Judge Jack opened an investigation of the death of a 14-year-old girl in state custody who died from a blood clot. Whatever the final outcome of the conflict between Judge Jack and state officials, one thing is clear: the state will no longer be allowed to ignore the needs of children in its charge. And changes are coming to the structure and operations of CPS. The responses of the legislator to the court's findings and rulings will redefine the duties and obligations that the state has to some of its most vulnerable members. The failure of Child Protective Services to protect its wards and the legislative and judicial responses to the CPS crisis demonstrate vividly why public policy matters to Texans in the 21st century. The policy-making process. In broadest terms, public policy refers to the outputs of governmental institutions. More narrowly, public policy can be defined as the expressed goals of a governmental body backed by incentives or sanctions. Public policies can be found in laws passed by legislative bodies as well as in the rules, regulations, and orders from properly authorized public agencies. The incentives or sanctions can include a wide range of strategies, from subsidies that reward individuals for acting in a certain way to monetary or criminal penalties that punish people for engaging in particular actions. One way that political scientists have approached the study of public policy is by focusing attention upon the different stages of the policy-making process. The political and administrative process through which governmental goals are identified, formulated, articulated into law, and evaluated. Analyzing stages of the policy-making process does not mean that public policy is made in a simple, linear way. The real world of policy making is, in fact, much messier. Stages in the process may overlap or even collapse into one another. Nevertheless, the idea that our stages of the policy-making process has proven to be useful analytical framework for understanding the various factors that go into the making of public policy. Problem identification. The first stage is problem identification. Here, society at large and actors in the political system develop an understanding of how we must think about and address a particular problem. Roger Cobb and Charles Elder refer to this set of ideas as a systematic agenda, where an issue is commonly perceived by members of the political community as meriting public attention and is involving matters within the legitimate jurisdiction of existing governmental authority. This systematic agenda is used by citizens and policymakers to understand the nature of public problems and to shape and direct the way policymakers will develop public policy aimed at them. For example, if we view the problem of poverty as fundamentally one of limited income, we might conclude that the best solution is increasing welfare payments to the poor. However, if we consider the problem to be behavior that causes people to be poor, such as unwillingness to work or poor job skills, We might conclude that policies directed toward encouraging work or subsidizing education are better courses of action. In the problem identification stage, our ideology, that is, our ideas, concepts, and visions about the way society works, plays a major role in defining public policy making. Policy formulation. Policy formulation is the second stage of the policy making process. Here, there are more general ideas that the public and lawmakers have about social and political problems are clarified, and strategies are for dealing with these specifically defined problems are developed. Policy formulation involves the detailed procedures that guide the passage of legislation and the development of administrative rules and regulations, setting the agenda on what problems will be discussed, how these problems will be understood, and what concrete measures will be taken to address them, lies at the heart of all policy formulation. I don't think there's any, there's no verb. Here's the vocabulary words for this section. Implementation. The third stage in the policy-making process is implementation. At this stage, the goals of public policy, along with the incentives or sanctions to support them, are put into effect by a particular government agency. Identifying the appropriate agency to implement a program is crucial at this stage. Similarly, budgetary policy plays a major role in the implementation stage and can determine the success or failure of a particular public policy. A well-formulated public policy can be dashed by poorly executed or poorly funded implementation. Evaluation. The fourth stage of the policy-making process is evaluation. At a certain point, all public policies must be evaluated for their effectiveness. In the best of all possible worlds, evaluation procedures would assess the stated goals of a particular policy against the actual outcomes of the implemented policy. Good evaluations would lead to a rethinking of the policy in light of the problem being addressed and the solutions formulated to address it. Similarly, good evaluation could lead to rethinking of the strategies being used and the resources being committed to implementing the policy. Closing the loop between problem identification, the problem evaluation is one of the most difficult problems facing policymakers. Some political scientists identify policy legitimation as another stage in the policy-making process. Legitimation, the establishment and recognition in the political community of the legality and constitutionality of a particular policy initiative, is probably better understood not as a separate stage, but as something that takes place throughout the entire policy-making process. Legitimation can include a wide range of activities open for discussion of a problem in the process, in the press, committee investigations, and oversight investigations. Following the appropriate rules for passing a bill in the legislature or making a rule in an administrative agency and judicial review of the policy. Establishing the legitimacy of a public policy throughout the various stages of policy-making process is an essential part of any democratic political system. Rationality in policymaking. An often stated goal of policymakers is to make public policy more rational and more efficient. Rationality in this regard generally refers to the idea that we have clearly identified the goals that we wish to achieve and have formulated and implemented policies that address these problems in an efficient manner. Efficiency refers to the idea that policy should maximize the outputs of government with a minimum commitment of resources. Given this commitment to rationality in policymaking, people are often surprised by how irrational and inefficient public policy can seem in a democracy. Part of the problem lies in the fact that the policy-making process is highly complex. Writing reports, holding committee hearings, and passing legislation is often involve political compromise that muddy the waters of policymaking. Vagueness in the problem identification stage, with compromises made among competing parties in the policy formulation stage, can work against the development of rational and efficient solutions to problems. Additional factors tend to work against rationality and efficiency in the making of public policy. The first is the fact that governments tend to work incrementally. Neither legislatures nor government agencies begin their work on a particular problem from scratch every year. Year in and year out, there is a general agreement among policymakers on the nature of a public problem and how it should be addressed. Programs, policies, and budgets tend to grow incrementally from one policy cycle to another. A second factor is that policymakers and other politically active individuals may not behave strictly rationally or efficiently. The economist Herbert Simon has argued that individual rationality is limited by a number of factors, including the expense of getting information about a problem, the cognitive limitations of the human mind, and the time constraints that all individuals face in making a decision, rather than seeking rationally understand everything that is involved in a particular policy problem or optimize every action taken to address this problem. Policymakers may simply seek to reach a decision that is satisfactory rather than optimal. This can lead to less than rational and less efficient public policy. To appreciate the process and politics of policymaking in Texas, we will turn to a discussion of three policy areas shaping Texas political life: education, welfare, and healthcare. Education policy. Education policy is complex. There is no one education problem that has been identified to drive education policy, nor is there just one formulated solution to this problem. Education policy in Texas involves a large number of overlapping problems, each of which has spawned a variety of solutions. Education is a big business in Texas. For the 2020-2021 biennium, a projected $49.7 billion in state general revenue monies went to public education. Local property taxes are projected to contribute $67.0 billion in revenue to local school districts. The federal government contributed an estimated $10.4 billion to fund a variety of education-related programs, including child nutrition grants, No Child Left Behind grants, disabilities funding, and other formula grants. There are 1,023 regular school districts in Texas, with over 8,096 public schools as of 2018. More than 5.4 million students were enrolled in public schools in Texas in 2019, second only to California. The student-teacher ratio is 15.1 students per teacher, compares favorably with the national average of 16.0, but the average expenditure of $9,375 per student is far below the national average of $12,201. Texas ranks 41st in per capita student expenditures in 2021. Along with the regular school districts, there are over 707 open enrollment charter school campuses serving 296,323 students. As of 2016-2017, although funded with public monies, charter schools have been set up as an alternative to traditional public schools, often because the public schools have failed to meet the needs of certain groups of students. Charter schools are in many ways more flexible than public schools, but they must meet the standard set by the state for public schools. There are many challenges facing educational policy in Texas, but a few stand out. First, there is a low level of public spending per pupil. Second, the demographics are not only increasingly people of color, but also increasingly disadvantaged. Of all students, 18.2% had limited English proficiency, 60.6% were considered economically disadvantaged, meaning they were poor, and 50.1% were considered at risk, meaning that given their circumstances, they were more likely to fail academically. Not surprisingly, these demographic characteristics often lead to lower performance on national and state tests. Third, Texas students have high dropout rates, particularly among Latinos and African Americans, which affect state and federal efforts to address the problem of poverty. To understand how policymakers are dealing with these challenges, we must look deeper into the making of educational policy since the funding of the state. The roots of educational policy. I'm going to go ahead and here is table 12.1 because it cuts off in the middle of the paragraph. The roots of educational policy in Texas. Through the first half of the 20th century, public education was largely a local affair. Schools were funded by local taxes, and decisions such as what to teach and how long the school year would be were made at the local level. Many school systems were chronically short of funds, facing such problems as shortages of supplies and textbooks, inadequate facilities, and poorly trained teachers. In 1949, the state legislature tried to address some of these problems by passing the Gilmer-Alkin laws, under which school districts were consolidated into 2,900 administrative units. State equalization funding was provided to supplement local taxes, teachers' salaries were raised, and a minimum school year of 175 teaching days was established. In addition, the laws established the Texas Education Agency, the TEA, originally known as the State Department of Education, to supervise public education in the state. The Gilmer-Alkin laws also established that elected 21-member State Board of Education as the policy-making body for public education, selecting budgets, establishing regulations for school accreditation, executing contracts for the purchase of textbooks, and investing in permanent school fund. The board also has the power to appoint a commissioner of education, subject to confirmation by the Texas Senate, who serves a 4-year term as the chief executive officer for the TEA. The TEA is responsible for setting standards for public schools and for handling federal funds related for public education. For the next 70 years, educational policy in the state would work through the overall institutional framework established by the Gilmer-Alkin laws. 3 specific challenges have played major roles in Texas educational policy over the last 50 years of desegregation, equity in funding, and the search for educational excellence. Each has its own set of policy formulations, implementation, procedures, and evaluation processes. Here's the vocabulary word for the next section, and I will go ahead and get this one for the other section. There you go. Desegregation. Few problems have troubled educational policy in Texas and given rise to such controversial policy formulations or implementations as much as desegregation. Segregation of the races was provided for under the Texas Constitution of 1876 and upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Through the now infamous Separate but equal doctrine in Texas is as elsewhere across the South. Segregated schools may have been separate, but they were far from equal. In the 1920s and 30s, for example, Texas spent an average of 1/3 less per student on the education of African American students than on White House students. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1954 case Brown versus Board of Education, ruling that state-imposed segregation in schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. School districts were ordered to desegregate their school systems. With all deliberate speed in Texas, the San Antonio School District became one of the first in the nation to comply with the order, but other districts in the state, such as Houston's, were much slower. The desegregation of public schools was hampered by political opposition at both the local and state levels. In 1957, the Texas legislature passed laws encouraging school districts to resist federally ordered desegregation, although then Governor Price Daniel Sr. chose to ignore them. By the late 1960s, legally segregated schools were largely a thing of the past. Nevertheless, de facto segregation remains a problem, particularly in urban areas with large minority populations. As in many other urban areas across the country, many middle and upper income whites in Texas abandoned urban public school systems for suburban public schools or private schools. Equity in funding. In addition to Brown versus Board of Education, two latter court cases have played a major role in shaping education policy and politics in Texas over the last 50 years. San Antonio versus Rodriguez and Edgewood Iisd versus Kirby. These cases forced policymakers to look at the funding problems of education in a new light and to formulate new solutions to address these problems. San Antonio versus Rodriguez was a landmark case involving the constitutionality of using property taxes to fund public schools. Lawyers for 8 children in the poor Edgewood Independent School District, IISD, in the San Antonio area argued that the system of financing public schools based on local property taxes was unfair. The Edgewood School District had one of the highest property tax rates in the country, but it could only raise $37 per pupil. Meanwhile, the neighboring school district of Alamo Heights was able to raise $413 per pupil with a much lower property tax rate. The reason was that the value of the property subject to taxation in Alamo Heights was far exceeded that in Edgewood. In 1971, a federal district court ruled that the Texas school finance system was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. However, on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, the decision was overturned. In 1973, the court ruled a 5-4 that the clause did not require states such as Texas to subsidize poor school districts. Edgewood Iisd versus Kirby. The second landmark case involved the financing of public schools was Edgewood Iisd versus Kirby. Unlike Rodriguez, Edgewood considered whether the system of funding public schools through local property taxes fulfilled the Texas state constitution provisions on education. Much of the litigation over the next few years would center on Article 7, Section 1 of the 1876 Constitution, which read, "A general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislator of the state to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of free public schools." A key constitutional issue would be exactly what constituted a general diffusion of knowledge and an efficient system of free public schools. On behalf of the Edgewood Iisd, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund sued William Kirby, the state commissioner of education. In 1984, initially only 8 school districts were represented in the case. By the time the case was finally decided, however, 67 other districts had joined the original plaintiffs. The plaintiffs argued that the state's reliance on local property taxes to fund public education discrimination against poor children by denying them equal opportunities in education. 1 month after the original case was filed, the legislature passed a modest reform measure that increased state aid to poor districts. In 1985, however, the plaintiffs filed an amended lawsuit arguing that the legislature's action was far from satisfactory. A state district judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, a decision that was reversed by the state's appeals court. But in 1989, in a 9-0 decision, the Texas Supreme Court held that the funding system was indeed in violation of the state constitution. The court held that education was a fundamental right under the Texas Constitution, and that the glaring disparities between rich and poor schools violated the efficiency clause of the Constitution. Although it did not demand absolute equality in per pupil spending, the court did require a standard of substantially equal access to similar revenues per pupil at similar levels of tax effort. It ordered the legislature to implement an equitable system by the 1990-91 school year. The ruling touched off a political firestorm that swept through Texas politics throughout the 1990s and into the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Over the years, various courts held various funding provisions for public education to be unconstitutional, and the legislature responded with various fixes, one of which was dubbed the Robin Hood Plan because it transferred funds from rich to poor districts. The back and forth wrangling over funding public education came to a head in 2013 when State District Judge John Dietz ruled that the state had violated the Constitution by underfunding schools during the 2011 session. But his ruling was not the last say in the matter. On May 13, 2016, the Texas Supreme Court overruled Judge Dietz's decision and declared the existing funding system to be constitutional, acknowledging that the system was Byzantine, undeniably imperfect, and open to improvement. The all-Republican court held with no dissents that it met the minimum constitutional provisions for the general diffusion of knowledge. Further, the court stated that its job was not to second-guess the legislature when it came to the best funding of public education. The importance of this decision to public education policy cannot be stressed enough. It had 2 immediate effects. First, state courts were taken out of the policy-making process regarding financing public education for the first time since the original Edgewood decision in 1989. Second, the debate over equity in financing public education was pushed firmly into the legislative budgetary process. The new debate over funding public education, giving the legislator primary responsibility to resolve funding questions, has not been without its challenges. There are essentially two sources that fund public education in the state. Here's the graph of who attends public schools in Texas. General revenue funding from the state and funding from local property taxes. During the 2017 legislative session, legislators cut $600 million from general revenue funding of public education in the face of a looming budget deficit. This cut came on top of the legislators' refusal to spend an additional $4 billion to keep funding levels per student equal to those of previous biennium. Legislators expected that increases in local property taxes of up to 7% per year would bridge the state's spending shortfall. This shift from state to local funding of public education reflected a long-term trend. In 2008, the state covered 48.5% of the cost of public education. By 2019, state support had dropped to 38%. The shifting burden of public school funding from state general revenues to local property taxes in turn sparked a new controversy. Bringing rising property taxes under legislation that would preempt local governments from raising taxes significantly without the support of a referendum vote. See Chapter 10. A special finance commission was set up to hold hearings around the state and delivered a report on the problem funding public education before the next legislative session in 2019. Funding public education and property tax reform were the two most important issues to come before a state legislator during the 2019 regular session. 120 bills related to education issues passed during the 2019 session, including the $6 billion in new funding and about $5 billion in property tax relief. Educational excellence and accountability in Texas. Whereas the debate over equity in public education was touched off by litigation, a different set of factors has driven the debate over the quality of education in the state and how best to promote educational excellence. The beginning of the debate in Texas over these issues was actually part of a larger national debate over the state education in the United States. A 1983 report by the National Commission on Excellence in Education, A Nation at Risk, identified a number of crises in the nation's educational system. Test scores were declining and functional literacy was on the rise. Students were simply not equipped with the intellectual skills required in the modern world. If steps were not taken soon to reform education in the United States, the report argued the nation was at risk of falling behind in the rapidly changing world of international competition. Educational reform was put on the state agenda in 1983 when the legislature established the Select Committee on Public Education, SCOPE, which was intended both to figure out how to fund pay raises for teachers and to evaluate the entire system of the public education in the state. In the end, SCOPE presented 140 recommendations for reform in its final report. On April 19, 1984, among the most controversial was No Pass, No Play, under which students who failed to earn a passing grade of 70 could not participate in any extracurricular activities for the next 6-week grading period. But No Pass, No Play was only the tip of the iceberg. Other proposals created new standards for students' attendance and performance, annual school performance reports, and tighter accreditation standards, with schools that did not meet the standards losing state funds. The longer school year extended from 175 to 180 days, and a professional career ladder for teachers that tied tied pay raises to performance. In July of 1984, many of the reform proposals were put into place in a 266-page education reform bill, along with the necessary accompanying tax increases. A second round in the debate over excellence and accountability in the public school system opened during the 1995 legislative session. There was a strong business and bipartisan support for reforms that supported increased accountability through testing. But there were some important differences from the scope reforms in the reforms package finally signed by Republican Governor George W. Bush. The scope reforms had generally centralized control over education policy in the state. The Bush reforms, in contrast, gave more discretion to local school districts to achieve the educational goals the state was mandating. Some of them were symbolic. The controversial no pass, no play rule was relaxed, cutting the period of non-participation from 6 to 3 weeks and lifting a ban on practicing while on scholastic probation. But other changes were more substantive. Local control of public schools was increased by limiting the power of the TEA. Local voters were empowered to adopt home charters that could free their school districts from many state requirements. The 1995 reforms also enabled students under certain circumstances to transfer from low-performing schools to high-performing schools in their districts, thus promoting competition among schools by holding them accountable for the performance of their students. One of the most controversial aspects of the reform movement was the development of statewide assessment standards. Testing as assessment came to be known was the first instituted in 1986 with the Texas Educational Assessment of Minimal Skills (TEAMS) exams, which sought to certify that students from all districts met certain minimum academic expectations. Students had to pass TEAMS to be eligible to receive high school diploma. 2 subsequent testing initiatives were ultimately replaced by the State of Texas Assessment and Academic Readiness, STAR, 15 end of course exams across the curriculum for grades 9 through 12. Beginning in 2011, the idea was to have passing standards increased with subsequent administrations of the exam. Schools would be held accountable for their student performances in the process. It was hoped that public education in Texas would ratchet upward in quality. Unfortunately, high-minded expectations were dashed as failure rates stayed stubbornly high. In 2012, the TEA reported that passing rates on 5 of the STAR end-of-course exams ranged from 87% in biology to 55% in English writing. Although failing students were allowed to retake the test, fears began to mount about the impact that failure rates would have on retention and graduation rates. In addition, a storm brewed up out of the classrooms as teachers and administrators complained about the growing need to teach the tests. Support among business and political elites for an expanded, intensified set of tests to reform public education collapsed during the 2013 legislative session. As we discussed in the introduction to Chapter 6, new groups with different interests emerged to challenge the consensus around accountability and testing that had driven educational reform policy for 25 years. Under House Bill 5, the state legislature cut the number of required end-of-course tests from 15 to 5. The idea of testing to promote academic excellence was not abandoned completely, but it no longer held center stage for reformers. As State Senator Dan Patrick the chair of the Senate Public Education Committee noted by the elimination of 15 tests to 5 that could save 40 or more days of testing, give teachers more time to teach, be innovative and creative. In 2015, the state legislature moved toward an accountability system that would evaluate schools on an A through F scale, replacing the old pass-fail system. Many educators rejected the scale, arguing that it relied too much on the standardized tests that were still being given, rather than how schools were improving. In 2017, the legislature tried again and finally passed a compromise bill on the last day of the session that proposed to evaluate schools on 3 dimensions: student achievement, student progress, and a closing the gaps measure. Elementary and middle schools would focus on the results of standardized state exams, while high schools would look at graduation rates and rates of students taking advanced courses. No one was completely satisfied with the final results, and many interest groups were upset that they were not able to weigh in on the final version of the compromise bill. Most interested parties expected that the issue of accountability and testing would come up again in the next legislative session. Here's the picture on the side. Education policy in a new era. One might have hoped that the educational reforms of the past 30 years would have ushered in an era of rising educational attainment in Texas in the 21st century. This has not happened. New problems identified by policymakers in recent years have led to new initiatives to overhaul education in the state. Despite the efforts of policymakers, teachers' salaries and overall state and local spending on public education have remained low compared with those in other states, as have graduation rates. In 2017, the average SAT scores in Texas were 515 in reading and 507 in math, compared with a national average of 531 in reading and 528 in math. Although the dropout rate in grades 7 through 12 has been declining since the 1990s, it has remained high among people of color. For a few years at the turn of the century, scores on standardized tests improved across the state, leading many to think that developing new assessments tests would succeed in holding teachers and schools more accountable. But with the implementation of the more rigorous STAR assessments, overall student performance stayed flat or fell on various tests. More disturbingly, that there appeared to be a growing achievement gap, as people of color and at-risk students failed at higher rates than whites in consecutive iterations of the test. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. Vouchers and charter school. The perceived failure or reform efforts based on testing and accountability led some to advocate new ideas in public education. One new idea, actually an old idea from the early 1960s, being offered by conservatives, particularly in the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party, is vouchers. The basic idea of vouchers is simple: increase competition in the school system by letting funding follow the students. If a public school doesn't work, let parents and students opt out of it and take their funding with them. Among the reoccurring criticisms of voucher-based reform is the middle and upper middle income students will leave poor students behind in poorly funded schools. An alternative to vouchers has been available to some in Texas through open enrollment charter schools. Like vouchers, the idea of charter schools is to make more options available to parents and students. particularly in places where schools are underperforming as part of a larger 1995 reform package. The legislature authorized the establishment of charter schools that would have increased flexibility to deliver education to student populations with special needs, working under their own charters, and granted the freedom to manage their own schools. Charter schools operate under the TEA and receive their own accountability ranking based on test scores. While they receive state monies, as of 2019, they do not receive local tax revenue or, in most cases, funding for facilities. Charter schools are able to receive privately raised funds. Criticism of charter schools resemble in some ways the criticism of vouchers. Opponents fear that charter schools will drain money from public schools while serving the needs of their specially identified student bodies. Some suggest that they will distract attention away from the needs of other, possibly more needy groups. In addition, there is some concern that charter schools will not be able to meet the challenges of educating youth any better than traditional public schools. Increased funding. A third alternative to current education policy is rather simple. Spend more money, a lot more money. Here the idea is that Texas schools fail because they are woefully underfunded. Salaries of teachers are too low, and state regulations on the curriculum and classroom are too great. Get the best teachers in the... Oh, I love it when they do that. Here's the graph for this area. Let me check real quick. I don't think there was no vocabulary words. Get the best teachers in the classroom. Some argue, and the problem of public education will be able to right itself. Vouchers and charter schools are seen as threats to this alternative. Interestingly, the public appears to be in favor of increased expenditures going to public education, but it splits along partisan lines. A poll conducted by the University of Texas in 2017 found that 71% of Texans believe that increasing pay to teachers would be an extremely effective or somewhat effective way of improving public education in Texas, including 91% of Democrats and 58% of Republicans. Even 41% of self-identified Tea Partiers agreed. But when respondents were asked if increasing overall funding would be effective, a different story emerged. 82% of Democrats agreed that increased overall funding would improve public education, but only 50% of Republicans did. One of the problems facing policymakers in the future will be formulating reform proposals amid a divided electorate, public education, and the coronavirus pandemic. In the spring of 2020, the coronavirus pandemic disrupted public education in Texas. Not since 1919 had the country or state experienced such a rapidly spreading contagion, one that threatened to overwhelm the healthcare delivery system in Texas. The public schools were seen to be incubators for the virus, and local and state officials felt that some actions had to be taken to contain the growing threat. On March 19, 2020, Governor Abbott issued an executive order that temporarily closed schools, along with restaurants, gyms, and bars across the state until April 3rd. The shutdown was then extended until May 4th, and then to the end of the school year. STAR testing was canceled for the 2019-2020 academic year. School districts scrambled to find ways to complete the academic year by offering academic work online. Curriculums and assessments had to be reconceived and prepared for delivery. Teachers and students had to learn how to use new software such as Zoom, Teams, WebEx, and Skype, and then how to deliver the classes over the internet. Virtual education, I'm so sorry, let me try and get that closer. There we go. Virtual education's exacerbated many of the inequalities found in Texas public school system. Middle class and wealthier students often had access to computers and internet service at home, though many poorer students did not. But even these wealthier students found themselves competing for computer and internet time with their parents, many of whom had to work while sheltering at home. Efforts were made by school districts to get less well-off students access to computers and internet hotspots so they could access online classes. But these efforts were far from being successful. Public officials welcomed the end of the school year in May and began to wonder what the future held in store. Throughout the late spring and early summer, a variety of plans for opening the public schools in the fall were being brought forward, ranging from the remaining fully virtual to staggering student attendance throughout the school week to opening schools completely. Decisions about how schools would operate in the 2020-2021 academic year likely would take place at the school district level, but could easily be affected by statewide or countywide public health orders. Most experts agreed that the key component of any reopening would be student safety. Barring an effective vaccine, this meant that reopening would have to take place under conditions of social distancing where students maintained a safe distance from one another, and effective testing and tracing of students who came down with the disease. These are difficult conditions to meet in a local environment. One thing was clear. The challenges facing public education would be difficult until the coronavirus was brought under control. Welfare policy. Another long-term policy issue in Texas has been how to provide for the basic needs of poor people in the state. The issue raises fundamental questions about the state's role in helping people in poverty and the extent to which national policies determine the state's response to the needs of the poor. Welfare policy is a clear example of how changes in problem identification and formulation can lead to an overhaul in policy implementation and evaluation. Poverty in Texas. Poverty has never been an easy topic to talk about in Texas. The idea that some individuals have trouble taking care of themselves or meeting the basic needs of their families seems to fly in the face of Texas' individualistic culture. In light of the booming Texas economy through much of the 21st century, many policymakers seem to have hoped that the poverty problems would go away. It hasn't. Policymakers define poverty in very specific terms. It is the condition under which individuals or families do not have the resources to meet their basic needs, including food, shelter, healthcare, transportation, and clothing. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Poverty Index calculates the consumption requirements of families based on their size and composition. The poverty index is adjusted every year to account for the rate of inflation. Although there is considerable controversy as to whether it adequately measures the minimal needs of a family, a poverty index is the generally accepted standard against which poverty is measured. In 2019, 13.6% of Texans, over the 3.8 million people, lived below the poverty line. The 5 counties of more than 10,000 residents with the highest percentage of people living in poverty were along the border, Willacy County, 35.0%, Starr County, 33.2%, Zavella County, 32.0%, Cameron County, 27.9%, Hidalgo County, 30.0%, and Zapata County, 28.4%. The counties with the lowest were three in the Dallas-Fort Worth area: Rockwall County, 5.1%, Collin County, 6.4%, and Denton County, 7.3%. One north of Austin, Williamson County, 6.4%, and two north of San Antonio, Kendall County, 7.5%, and Como County, 7.1%. In addition, in 2019, a total of 3.9 million people, approximately 13.4% of all residents of Texas, were enrolled in Medicaid, the federally financed state-operated program providing medical services to low-income people, and over 3.4 million people participated in the nation's most important anti-hunger program, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP. Poverty remains one of the most intractable problems facing the state. In 2020, the federal poverty law guidelines was $12,760 a year for one person and $4,480 a year for each additional person in the family. In 2019, the U.S. Census Bureau calculated that 13.6% of Texans lived in poverty, 12th worst in the nation among states. A study conducted by the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation in 2019 found that over 18.7% of Latinos, 18.4% of African Americans, and 7.9% of whites in Texas are poor. Of those over the age of 65 in Texas, 10.5% are poor, compared with 9.2% in the nation as a whole. Poverty among children under age 18 is much higher in Texas, 19%, than in the United States as a whole, 16.6%. Texas uses federal poverty guidelines to determine eligibility for a variety of social programs. For example, a family of three is eligible for reduced price meals if the family is no more than 185% of the poverty level. A family of three is eligible for free school meals and food stamps, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, if the family is at no more than 130% of the poverty level. The Texas Health and Human Services Commission, HHS, which since 2003 has overseen the Department of Family and Protective Services, the Department of Assistive and Rehabilitative Services, the Department of Aging and Disability Services, and the Department of State Health Services, is responsible for coordinating, determining eligibility for, and administering the major welfare and anti-poverty programs. In Texas, see Table 12.2. These programs include Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TAMF, a welfare program for families with dependent children, Medicaid, SNAP, and other programs to address family violence, provide disaster relief, and settle refugees. The appropriated budget for the Hhs program in the 2020-2021 biennium was $76.7 billion. With an additional $4.4 billion allocated to the Department of Family and Protective Services. See the introduction to this chapter for a discussion of DFPS, and $1.7 billion allocated to the Department of Health Services. Hhs agencies employ almost 41,000 state workers at more than 1,000 locations. Poverty is complicated. Poverty is a complicated policy issue in Texas. There are more than 200 programs administered by HHS that are aimed at different problems related to poverty. We will now focus attention on two of the most important of these initiatives: welfare in this section and healthcare financing in the following section, understanding how these programs evolved over time and the reforms that have been put into place over the past 20 years will shed considerable light on public policy making in the state. Here's the vocabulary words for the next section. Oh my gosh, my camera keeps getting red. I'm so sorry, guys. I want you guys to see this. There we go. Welfare in Texas, 1935 through 1996. The origins of modern welfare policy lie in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Prior to the 1930s, welfare was considered a state and local responsibility. The Great Depression overwhelmed many state and local welfare arrangements, however, causing the federal government to expand its role in addressing the needs of the poor and the unemployed. The Social Security Act of 1935 transformed the way in which welfare policy was implemented in the United States, administered and determined the benefit levels for a series of welfare programs, but in exchange for federal assistance and funding. The programs had met certain minimum federal guidelines. The Department of Federal Public Welfare was established in Texas in 1939 to run the state's various public assistance programs. Its name would eventually be changed to the Department of Health and Human Services in 2003, reflecting a shift in policymakers' desire to think of the agency less as a welfare provider and more as a service agency to people in poverty. In the 1960s, new federal programs aimed at poverty proliferated. In 1965, Congress established Medicaid, a state federal program to finance health care for the poor. President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty also expanded the number of social service programs available to the poor. Increasingly, it was argued the solution to alleviating poverty, poverty was through expanded federal control over welfare programs. In 1972, a new federal program called Supplementary Security Income, SSI, replaced earlier state federal anti-poverty programs for the elderly, the blind, and the permanently disabled. Between 1967 and 1973, participation rates and expenditures for welfare in Texas exploded. The number of children on the nation's major welfare program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, more than quadrupled from 80,000 to 325,000, while the number of families on AFDC more than quintupled from 23,000 to 120,000. Rates leveled off in the late 1970s, but began to push upward again in the 1980s. Here is the vocabulary words for the next section. The idea of dependency and welfare reform in the 1990s. By the mid-1980s, a new critique of welfare programs had begun to emerge, which led to a new understanding of what the problem of poverty was and how solutions might be developed to address it. At its heart lay the idea that the well-intentioned policies of the 1960s had backfired and created a dysfunctional underclass of people dependent on welfare. Programs such as AFDC may have helped people financially in the short run, but in the long run, some argued they had robbed people of the character traits and moral values that would enable them to succeed in a market economy. These critics believed that the skyrocketing rates of children born to poor unwed mothers was in part the result of a perverse set of incentives created by welfare programs. Under the existing welfare system, at least up to a point, the more children one had, the higher one's welfare payment, because some states, including Texas, did not provide welfare to families with fathers in the home. Fathers were actually being encouraged to abandon their families so that the families might qualify for welfare. According to critics, the poor didn't need a permanent source of income from the state. They needed encouragement and proper incentives to become independent workers. Growing discontent over the welfare policy across the country encouraged many states, including Texas, to seek waivers from federal regulations so that they might experiment with reform. Welfare became an issue during the 1994 state elections. The winner of that year's governor's race, Republican George W. Bush, echoed conservative critics of the welfare system, arguing that it was robbing people of their independence. Among the changes he called for were strengthening child support procedures and penalties, imposing a 2-year limit on benefits for recipients able to work, requiring individuals receiving welfare to accept state-sponsored job if after 2 years they were unable to find work, creating new child care and job training programs, requiring unwed mothers to live with their parents or grandparents, moving family support systems from the state to the local level. Data released by the comptroller, John Sharp, a Democrat, lent support to Bush's contention that there were serious problems with the existing system of welfare in Texas. Over 1/4 of all welfare recipients in 1993 were long-term recipients who had remained on the rolls for 5 years or more. The publication of a partnership of independence welfare reform in Texas by the Comptroller's Office helped to set the legislative agenda for the debate over welfare policy. The report documented how welfare often failed to help those most in need and how it encouraged those already on it to become dependent on government largesse. Among the report's 100 proposals were many of the reforms that had been implemented by conservative reformers in other states. A bipartisan legislative coalition ultimately supported major welfare reform in Texas. On May 26, 1995, the vote on House Bill 1863 was 128-9 in the House and 30-1 in the Senate. The law provided a number of carrot and stick incentives that sought to mold the character of welfare recipients in positive ways and wean them off of welfare. Among the carrots were expanded education and job training programs, as well as pilot studies involving transitional child care and medical benefits. Among the sticks were limitation to benefits to 36 months, alimony for ex-spouses in poverty who couldn't support themselves, and a 5-year ban on reapplying for benefits once they ran out. To implement the state reforms, Texas secured a waiver that freed the state from various federal regulations regarding welfare programs. In granting the waivers to Texas and other states, President Bill Clinton's administration hoped to stimulate innovative reforms that might be duplicated elsewhere. Texas was ahead of the welfare reform curve in 1995. In 1996, Clinton signed into law the most important reform in federal welfare policy since the New Deal, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Essentially thought the assumption that had guided the expansion of welfare programs for 60 years under the legislation AFDC jobs Jobs, a work-related training program, and the Emergency Assistant Program were combined into one block grant titled the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TAMP. As with the welfare reforms instituted in Texas and other states, the primary purpose of TAMP was to make families self-sufficient by ending the cycle of dependency on government benefits. States were given great flexibility in setting benefit levels, eligibility requirements, and other program details. Today in Texas, TAMP provides temporary financial assistance to single-parent and two-parent families in which one or both parents are unemployed or have disability. The program also provides a one-time $1,000 payment to individuals in certain crisis situations. To qualify for TAMP, a recipient's income must be less than $188 a month for a family of 3, one parent, 2 dependent children. People participating in TAMP receive a monthly assistance payment based on the size of their family. They cannot receive this assistance for more than 60 months, but they are also eligible for Medicaid benefits, SNAP, and child daycare services. Unless legally exempt, recipients are also required to participate in an employment services program, attending parenting skills classes, get vaccines for their children, and make sure their children go to school, and agree not to use or not to abuse drugs or alcohol. The maximum monthly grant available to a household of under 3 TAMP is low, only $303 a month for a home with one parent. For the 2020 through 2021 biennium, TAMP expenditures were projected to be $96.3 million, including $86.5 million from general revenue funds, and the remainder from the federal government. This expenditure has been dropping significantly since 1995 due to decreasing caseloads brought on by welfare reform at the national level. Here's the vocabulary word for the next section. I hope you can read that. It is so blurry. Sometimes I have to wipe my camera. If it gets too hot, guys, I'm sorry. There we go. Evaluating welfare reforms. Texas is now into its third decade of welfare policy as reformed by the state and federal government in the 1990s. The success of the welfare reforms in Texas has been evaluated along a number of dimensions, 2 of which stand out. Judged by changes in the number of people on welfare, the reforms appear to be a success. The average monthly number of people on welfare in Texas rose from a little more than 500,000 to 1989 to a peak of more than 750,000 in 1994, then began to fall after the 1995 reforms. The decline in the number of people on welfare continued over the next decade, falling to approximately 156,000 people in 2006 and to approximately 40,000 in early 2020. Of these recipients, 86% are children. Judged by a second measure, the number of people moving from welfare to work, the result of the 1995 reforms, have been more than mixed. Studies over the past decade have found that the caseload for TAMP has fallen and that workforce in Texas has grown. As the Great Recession has faded from memory, fewer individuals are relying on TAMP for their income. Poverty measures have also fallen in Texas as the percentage of those in Texas living in poverty fell to 13.6%. Jobs have generally seemed to be available for people willing and able to work, but some statistics trouble policymakers as they evaluate the success of welfare reforms. In 2019, Texas' overall poverty rate was of 13.6%, and the percentage of children under the age of 18 in poverty, 19%, were both high by national standards. Though the welfare reforms instituted the 1990s and reaffirmed over the next 20 years may have curtailed welfare expenditures to poor people, this simply means that fewer people in poverty are getting cash assistance. In 1995 to 1996, 43% of poor families in Texas received TAMP funds, compared with 68% nationwide. 2015-2016, the numbers had dropped to 4% in Texas and 23% nationwide. One study found that of the 619,400 families living in poverty in Texas and 282,400 families living in deep poverty in Texas, only 26,400 received TAMP. In 2015-2016, little has happened since 2017 to change these figures. Public spending on monetary assistance programs such as TAMP has declined sharply over the last 20 years, as the number of people enrolled in the program has declined. At the same time, however, funding for non-cash assistant programs has more than tripled during the same time period and is now over $700 million in Texas. As welfare rolls and expenditures have declined, Texas has used the federal block grant funds allocated to it to funding anti-poverty initiatives to cover a wide range of other programs, including Child Protective Services, the program we discussed in the introduction to this chapter. Other block grant monies have gone to early childhood intervention services and mental health state hospitals. In the 2018-2019 budget, $3 million of this block grant money will go to abortion alternative programs, and $4 million a year will go to the Texas Education Agency for school improvement and support programs. The welfare reforms of the 1990s have not eliminated poverty by making people in poverty more independent, but the reforms have clearly redirected the way in which Texas addresses the needs of poor people in the state, away from cash assistance and towards social services. Welfare and the coronavirus. The coronavirus pandemic may be changing how Texans perceive and experience poverty, and how the state may be responding to it in the future. Although he had issued an executive order closing public schools in mid-March, Governor Abbott had resisted issuing a shelter-in-place policy throughout the state. He encouraged local officials to institute a more restrictive policies if they deemed appropriate to prevent the spread of the disease in their communities. In late March, local county judges from many of the larger counties such as Dallas, Harris, Travis, and Bexar counties did precisely that, ordering shelter-in-place policies for their communities. The orders had a devastating impact on local economies. Anything not deemed as an essential business to the economy ground to a halt. Unemployment rates exploded between March and April of 2020. Over 1.8 million Texans applied for unemployment insurance, more than had applied in all of 2019. The unemployment rate rose from 3.5% in February 2020 to 4.7% in March and showed no signs of letting up. In May, the collapse in the price of oil in the spring only made matters worse as the oil industries started cutting back on employment for reasons unrelated to the pandemic. Unemployment affected all income classes, but poor people who had little savings to begin with were hit hardest. Food became scarce for many people, including students participating in free lunch programs at public schools. Many schools continued to provide food to poor students, even though they were closed for classes. In March of 2020, the number of people applying for SNAP program doubled from the previous year, from 114,008 applications in 2019 to 230,809 in 2020. Long lines formed outside food banks that distributed free food to those in need. For many of the less well off, it looked like the beginnings of a new depression. An existing welfare system was struggling to address the needs of people in poverty in a satisfactory manner. State leaders such as the governor and lieutenant governor began calling for policies that would open up the economy almost as soon as it was closed. Getting people back to work would put money in people's pockets and food on their tables. There was a danger that opening the economy could spark a second wave of the coronavirus infections throughout Texas, but this had to be balanced against the pressing needs of people needing wages and food. If the economy was not jump-started relatively soon, in late 2020 or early 2021, policymakers likely would have to rethink the entire thrust of welfare policy in the state. Medicaid and healthcare policy. Healthcare insurance is a major policy problem facing Texas. People get health insurance from a variety of sources, including employer-provided policies, individually purchased policies, Medicare, a federal program for the elderly, and Medicaid, a state federal program for poor people. In 2018, an estimated 17.7% of Texans were uninsured, the highest percentage of any state and much higher than the 10% figure for the U.S. population as a whole. Figure 12.1 shows the breakdown of this uninsured population by age, group, and race, ethnicity. Approximately 855,800 children under the age of 18% were without insurance, far above the national average of 14%. Medicaid. Other than health insurance programs established for state employees, Texas' principal policy initiative regarding health care and health insurance is Medicaid, a program closely linked to poverty programs. Medicaid, which provides for health care of poor, love it when it doesn't. Here's the graph. Poor people, particularly poor children, and especially costly program for the state. The caseload for Medicaid has exploded in recent years, pushed up by the Great Recession and the coronavirus pandemic. For the 2020-2021 biennium, $61.5 billion in federal and state funds has been appropriated for the Medicaid program in Texas. Of these funds, $37.9 billion is from the federal government sources, while the remaining $23.6 billion is from state sources. There is an economic caveat to these appropriations in that they do not include full funding for anticipated increases due to the medical inflation, higher utilization, or increased acuity. As in the recent biennium budgets, the legislature decided to underfund the medical program for the 2020-2021 biennium. For now, waiting for supplemental appropriations in 2023 to make up the difference. Medicaid is a joint state-federal program established under the Social Security Amendments of 1965. As Title 19 of the Social Security Act, this act requires that Texas and other states follow certain principles and meet certain standards if they are to receive federal money to help fund the programs. First, Medicaid services must be available on a statewide basis. Second, the same level of service must be available to all clients throughout the state. Children are entitled to a broader range of services than adults. Third, participants must be allowed to use any healthcare provider who meets the program standards. Providers, of course, must be willing to accept Medicaid recipients. Fourth, the amount, duration, and scope of medical services must be sufficiently reasonable. Exactly what kind and how much of these services are considered sufficiently reasonable is vague and often contested, and Medicaid reimbursement rates for providers tend to be much lower than those under controversial private plans. While Texas may limit the services provided to adult clients, it may not be arbitrary deny services for specific conditions or illnesses. Federal law also allows states to be granted waivers from these principles to create programs directed toward particular clients. In this approach, federal Medicaid policy mirrors the initiatives in welfare policy that give states more freedom of action in developing programs to serve clients. Medicaid participation. Over the last 5 decades, Medicaid has grown from a narrowly defined program targeting low-income people on public assistance to a large, complex program serving a variety of special groups. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Medicaid was expanded to include older adults not fully covered by Medicare, people with disabilities and pregnant women. Individuals participating in TAMP and SSI automatically qualify for Medicaid, as do others who meet these other criteria. A variety of factors can affect an individual's eligibility to participate in Medicaid. For example, eligibility can change when a parent or caregiver has a change in income, when a child is born, or when a child reaches a certain age. For these reasons, there is significant fluctuation in Medicaid enrollment from month to month. Figure 12.2 shows participation today in Medicaid by gender, age, race, and ethnicity. Administration and financing of Medicaid in Texas. In Texas, Medicaid is administered through the Texas Health and Human Services Health Commission at the federal level, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid in the Department of Health and Human Services monitor Texas Medicaid program and establish basic services delivery, quality, funding, and eligibility standards. Through Medicaid, Texas and the federal government together pay for a variety of healthcare services for a number of low-income populations, including the physician's bills, inpatient care in a hospital, outpatient care and pharmacy lab and x-ray services. Medicaid also provides for selected long-term and support services, including home and community-based services for the disabled, home health and personal care and nursing services. There is no cap on Medicaid expenditures in Texas. The federal portion of the financing for the program is determined every year by comparing average state per capita income to the average national per capita income. Lower income states receive a larger share of federal assistance than higher income states. Each state thus has its own FMAP, Federal Medical Assistance Percentage. In 2018, the FMAP for Texas was 58%, which means that 42% of all Medicaid expenditures were state funded. A program related to Medicaid is the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, which provides coverage for children and families with incomes too high to qualify for Medicaid. Established in 1997 under the Title 21 of the Social Security Act, CHIP is administered like Medicaid through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services federal funds for CHIP are capped. When a state's cap is reached, no more funds are available. As with Medicaid, there is a match rate based on the state's average per capita income. For Texas, the match rate in 2019 was 93.7%, meaning the state only funded 6.3% of the CHIP expenditure. Medicaid and CHIP expenditures have become an increasing increasing part of both the national and state budgets. In 1996, the total Texas Medicaid budget, both federal and state dollars, was $8.2 billion. For the 2020-2021 biennium, the total Medicaid budget in all, did it right in the middle. Okay, here you go. I hope it's not blurry. In all funds was $61.5 billion, 24.8% of the state budget. CHIP appropriations were $2.0 billion in all the funds budget for 2021. There's no vocabulary words. Broader health care issues in Texas. Medicaid policy is embedded in a larger national discussion over health care in America and the proper way to fund it. Numerous controversies divide the public and politicians at levels of government. Is healthcare fundamentally a private or public issue? How can exploding healthcare costs, including the cost of private insurance such as Blue Cross Blue Shield or public insurance such as Medicare and Medicaid, be brought under control? Should individuals be compelled to purchase healthcare insurance? If so, how much and what kind of insurance? Who should pay for for individuals who cannot afford to pay for private insurance themselves? What is the proper role for the state and federal governments in the delivery of health care across the nation? As in other state federal programs, federal money for Medicaid is accompanied by federal rules and regulations with which the state must comply to maintain this funding. This sometimes breeds tremendous political controversy between the state of Texas and the federal government. Cost is the single most important issue confronting makers regarding Medicaid in Texas. Now encompassing more than 29% of the state expenditures, Medicaid in Texas threatens to overwhelm the budget. In the spring of 2012, Texas Comptroller Susan Combs began referring to Medicaid as the Big Red, the program that was going to push an otherwise healthy state budget into the red. She claimed that by 2023, Big Red is going to be over a third of state spending. Medicaid expenditures, many mandated by the federal government, would begin to crowd out other forms of spending in the state budget. Policymakers are forever looking for ways to make the programs less costly. Two strategies have predominated over the past 20 years. First, to bring more efficiency into the programs, and second, to institute cost controls and cutbacks to providers. Both efforts have had limited success and at the same time have sparked concern over the quality of care being offered to Medicaid participants across the state. As cost containment efforts intensify, Texas policymakers inside and outside the legislature will be compelled to increase their monitoring of delivery of the process. The Affordable Care Act. In March 2010, Congress passed two bills, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act and the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010, while together became known as the Affordable Care Act, ACA. Often referred to as Obamacare, the passage of the ACA transformed the debate over healthcare policy in the United States. Passed on a party line vote by Congress, the legislation required individuals not covered by existing plans to purchase health insurance or pay a penalty. The provision was eliminated beginning in 2019, along with the individual mandate, as the mandatory coverage came to be called. The act also increased coverage for pre-existing conditions and expanded medical insurance to an estimated 30 million people at the time. Here's the graph for this area. Oops. When fully implemented, the ACA was expected to bring significant change to the health insurance market in Texas, as well as to Texas Medicaid programs. Initial estimates in 2012 projected that under the ACA, insurance coverage in Texas would rise to 91%, with almost 40% of the remaining uninsured being undocumented persons. The expansion of Medicaid in Texas would be funded through a complicated set of subsidies based on family income. For the first 3 years of the expansion, 2014 to 2016, the federal government would cover all costs for newly eligible participants in Medicaid and CHIP. Thereafter, the percentage would slowly decline, committing Texas to a larger portion of the funding. The long-term effect of the ACA for Texas would be a budgetary one. Increased expenditures on Medicaid and healthcare in Texas were all but inevitable. The ACA sparked a national controversy. A majority of the states, including Texas, and a number of private individuals and groups challenged the constitutionality of the act in court, focusing on the mandatory coverage provisions. For 3 days in March 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court held oral arguments on the case. National Federation of Independent Business versus Casellas. A complicated decision was delivered by a divided court on June 28, 2012. 4 liberal judges believed that the most features of the ACA were constitutional. 4 conservative judges countered that they were not. Representing the decisive vote, Chief Justice Roberts rejected the idea that people could be mandated or forced by insurance under Congress's power to regulate commerce. But he nevertheless concluded that a tax penalizing people who did not get medical insurance met constitutional muster. Regarding the expansion of Medicaid, he supported a conservative position, arguing the states could not be bullied into expanding medical insurance coverage for lower income segments of the population. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that for federalism to thrive, states had to have a meaningful and real choice as to whether or not they would participate in federally sponsored programs. The complicated court decision opened the door for a new round of political posturing around the health care issue in Texas. Governor Perry announced that Texas would refuse to participate in the expanded Medicaid program, giving up millions of federal dollars for not having to incur new financial responsibilities to the state level. The state legislators supporting Governor Perry has refused to expand Medicaid in Texas. An estimate by the Kaiser Family Foundation in 2014 concluded that over 1 million uninsured adults in Texas, 17% of the uninsured in the state, would not be brought under the ACA provisions to expand Medicaid because the Texas actions or inactions. Perry also decided that the state would not go into business of designing an insurance exchange in the state. Texas would let the federal government sell federally designed insurance policies in the state on its own. Tax reform in 2017 under the Trump administration further muddled the waters surrounding the provisions of the ACA. Originally, the ACA required individuals to prove that they were insured when they filed for their federal income taxes, or they would incur a tax penalty. As noted above, this provision was held constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, upholding the mandate as a tax, not interstate commerce in NFIB versus Casellas. However, the Trump-inspired
2017 Tax Reconciliation Act removed the tax penalties while keeping the mandate beginning in 2019. This effectively undercut an important part of the ACA's initiatives to lower the number of uninsured people through tax penalties. Although the ACA is still in effect, it is unclear what will mean for lower income Texans over the long run. See Figure 12.3. Health insurance coverage overall has increased in Texas since 2013. The percentage of uninsured in Texas has dropped between 2013 and 2018 from 22.1% to 17.7%. Though this is still the highest rate of uninsured in the nations. Texas' refusal to participate in the optional state federal expansion of Medicaid has effectively denied insurance coverage to many poor people. And then there is the issue of undocumented workers in Texas, who compose a growing number of uninsured individuals. Trump tax reforms have raised even more questions about the future of the ACA and health care in Texas. One thing is clear: few individuals are willing to argue that Texas has solved that problem by providing health care to poor people, Medicaid in the coronavirus pandemic. As in the areas of public education and welfare policy, the coronavirus posed new unexpected challenges to Medicaid and healthcare policy in Texas. The virus threatened to overwhelm Texas' public healthcare system across the state, as it had in New York City. If preventative measures were not taken early on to stem the outbreak, the shelter-in-place orders put into effect by county judges in large urban and suburban counties in March of 2020 were aimed at flattening the curve, meaning holding down the exponential spread of the contagion so that hospitals would not be overwhelmed by seriously ill patients. Going into summer, it appeared that this strategy was working, but not without steep costs. Routine medical services were seriously cut back as the healthcare community mobilized to face the pandemic. In the process, hospitals, private medical practices, and clinics started to hemorrhage money as they focused all of their attention on seriously ill coronavirus patients. Rising rates of unemployment left many more people with no medical insurance at the very time that they had needed it the most. Some funding assistance came from the federal government in the early spring, notably funds in support of testing, but for the most part, the public health system limped along, hoping that pandemic would recede on its own and life could get back to some new normal. The COVID-19 outbreak exposed the fragile financial foundations upon which public health care in Texas rested. Decisions not to expand Medicaid, as most other states had after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, now left a growing portion of the population facing the pandemic on their own, without medical insurance and perhaps without a job. The question of medical insurance and expanding Medicaid would likely be raised with renewed intensity in the next legislative session as policymakers tried to learn the lessons the pandemic had to teach. Public policy and the future of Texas. In this chapter, we examined various aspects of social policy making in Texas. We focused particular attention on the complex issues that have driven the various stages of the policy making process in public education, welfare, and healthcare. Looking at these matters with a critical eye to the future demands that we pay attention to a number of key political questions. How are problems identified by policymakers and the public at large? What kinds of solutions are formulated to address these problems? Who benefits by a particular public policy? Who pays for the policy? What ideas are used to justify or legitimate a particular program? How are programs evaluated? How do particular public policies evolve and change over time to address new problems? How do they alter the relationship between individual citizens and the government that represent them in Austin? In earlier chapters, we saw how the high-tech revolution transformed Texas' economy in the 1980s and 90s. We also traced how social and political changes have restructured the political party systems in the state and increased the power of the Republican Party. In this chapter, we have seen how many of these shifts resulted in important changes in public policy in the 20th and 21st centuries. What will be the future of public policy in the areas of education, welfare, and healthcare? What issues will be seen as problems? What policies will be formulated to address these problems? How will those new policies be implemented, evaluated, and legitimated? Going into the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021, policymakers' concerns in education, welfare, and healthy policy centered upon responding to the challenges of the coronavirus outbreak in Texas, educating children in person, and only lay at the heart of education policy. Getting basic food, income, and healthcare needs met for those people in poverty were also center stage. Once the pandemic is over, however, other long-term issues will surely return to prominence. Funding and fairness issues in public education will be dominated by the legislator now that the courts have pulled out the business of figuring out what was meant in the Constitution by efficiently. Charter schools likely will continue to expand, challenging the dominance of traditional public schools. Poverty policy will continue to take a backseat to other policy areas as the state continues to find ways to reform welfare by ending dependency and by putting people back to work. The wild card for the state may be healthcare policy. Will the state ever accept the expansion of Medicaid and insurance services provided under the Affordable Care Act? What will be done to address the continuing problem of the uninsured? What lessons has Texas learned from the coronavirus pandemic? Must the poor be allowed to fend for themselves, even those who are too young to do much fending? There is a chance that the state will punt on these issues, leaving segments of the poor and uninsured exposed. This is the end of Chapter 12 in Governing Texas. Thank you.